sort of looking forward to them being here even for the law school event, in part because I think it's a very interesting symbol that they represent. These are folks who, and you'll see this tonight if you come, are really quite embedded in a narrative of white victimhood, right? They fundamentally believe that they as white people are oppressed and marginalized. One of the websites that was sending around information about my speech, in which I was referred to as a pig rat Jew, which the pig part is ironic given the Jewish part. It's a mixed metaphor and it's not real smart, but okay, they're Nazis, so what do you expect? They were sending this thing around, and the name of that website is Daily Slave. Right? And you're like, well, what is that? Well, they literally believe, from what I can gather, that white people are being literally enslaved by multiculturalism, literally enslaved by reverse discrimination, literally victimized at every turn in this America of the 21st century. And the reason that's fascinating and highly pertinent to the conversation I want to have with you is that, as bizarre as that sounds to us, I hope, as bizarre as that sounds to us, that mentality of white folks as the victims, that inversion of racial reality, isn't actually new, and it isn't something that has only been articulated by overt white nationalists and white supremacists. Indeed, it is something that has been echoed and said and claimed and proclaimed quite literally by some of the nation's most powerful individuals throughout history, including our most esteemed jurists. And so if we go back to the post-Civil War period, and we look at the veto that Andrew Johnson, the president after the assassination of Lincoln, the veto that he issued with regard to the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which was passed, and he vetoed it, right? When he did that, here's what he said. He said that the reason he was vetoing it was because the act did something specific for black people more than had ever been done for white folks. He said that the policies of that Civil Rights Act are infinitely beyond any that the central government have ever provided for the white race. Right? In other words, it's preferential treatment. You're setting aside money for black folks who have just been freed from enslavement through the Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen's Bank. How dare you do that? We've never done anything like that for white people. Right? Very interesting mentality, ignoring the obvious truth that the whole history of the country up to that point had been exactly that for white people, right? That in fact the entire system had been established for the benefit of white people, so when you do that, you don't have to have special laws for the people who've always been included in the opportunity structure. You have to have a special law for the people who've been excluded, but to Johnson, that was tantamount to, even though he didn't use the phrase, reverse discrimination and white victimhood. A few years later, and law students will certainly know this if you've looked at the civil rights cases and the court's decision in invalidating so many of the laws that were passed in the wake of the Civil War and during the Reconstruction era.
Hello brothers and sisters, welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you are doing great from wherever you're watching me from. In today's video, particularly this one, talking about the way Tim Wise addresses the white community. I feel like it is the first time we need to give Tim Wise his flowers, because it's amongst the white scholars who are anti-racist white scholars who call out white people for who they are. And I think some people are not taking this lightly, and they are trying to do anything to tarnish his name. But I'd like to take this chance to thank him for speaking what a lot of white scholars don't want to talk about. For those who don't know Tim Wise is a prominent anti-racist scholar and author. He has spent a lot of his time, much of his career, deconstructing the idea of white privilege and exposing the deeply entrenched structures of systemic racism in the United States. One of the key things that he addressed in the context is how white Americans often deflect discussions of racism by accusing black people of playing victim. According to Tim Wise, this accusation is not only intellectually dishonest, but it is historically and morally bankrupt. When we talk about all these issues, I want you to think about it this way. This is a person, Tim Wise is a white person using his white privilege to call out white people. Because from examples that he'll be giving from a white person who has earned a white privilege. And so this gives him a cushion to call out white folks, because when white people go and see on the camera and say, oh, it's a white person, interesting. So it gives him a cushion from not people saying that black people are complaining about racism. Because amongst the things that you're going to be discussing about is the question of black people always playing victimhood. And I think I've always tried to address this in all of other of my videos. And so without saying a lot, I want to sweat this video. I'll be back and then we'll be having a great discussion in regards to this. I'm just going to be asking you, fast forward, if you're watching this video for the first time, I'm going to be asking you to please subscribe to the channel and join my membership and really get to see what I can offer you. Remember, this channel only gives commentary on educational things. Some things that might be debatable, but at the end of the day, we come in the middle and say, now, you have said the answer is A, I've said the answer is B. How can we have a middle ground for us to come together and agree on one thing? Now, join me in today's discussion. I'm hosting Dr. Tim Wise, who is going to talk about important things in this video. And I hope you all buckle up for this video. It's going to be a good one. It's going to be a real one. Let's watch the video. I'll be back.
You know what Justice Bradley said as he was helping to strike down those policies, many of which I just mentioned, Freedmen's Bureau, Freedmen's Bank, and different laws that were intended to uplift former chattel. And what did Bradley say? He said that it was time for blacks to stop being the, quote, special favorite of the laws and take their place among mere citizens, end of quote. Right? In other words, all this special stuff we've been doing for black folks, ever since they were freed from enslavement, which at that point had been maybe 20 years, right? Roughly 18 to 20 years. That's too much. That's gone too far. It's time for them to be mere citizens like the rest of us. Once again, a very ahistoric understanding of citizenship, because indeed, until the end of the Civil War and those amendments that were passed by the Congress in the wake of that, they were the only citizens. So the idea that black folks should now just be mere citizens like the rest of us presumes that whites had ever been just citizens. We were not just citizens, we were the only ones. The whole system established for our benefit, and then after a 2-decade period where there's a slight attempt to balance those scales, not reparations, not 40 acres and a mule, nothing like that, right? Very minor interventions on behalf of those who had just recently been emancipated. The court was saying enough, too much, no more. In other words, what the traditionalist youth network folks who are coming tonight are saying, though it is a more extreme version of the white victim narrative, isn't really all that far removed from a narrative that has a very long pedigree and a much more respectful one than the individuals who are going to come this evening. So we need to confront what that means. We need to think about what it means that the Supreme Court of the United States, the president, Andrew Johnson at that time, of the United States could be so ahistoric in their understanding of social truth, because this is what the law has often done. Like, legal jurisprudence doesn't always follow what the social science tells us. Right? Legal jurisprudence doesn't always follow what history and morality and ethics tell us. It doesn't always keep up with what the social sciences and the psychological sciences and brain science tell us about racial bias. And so a lot of our laws that I'll be talking about here in a second regarding discrimination and civil rights are actually taking place against a sort of colorblind backdrop that doesn't allow us to actually make note of social truth and how the law is shaped by that. We have this colorblind, color-mute jurisprudence increasingly coming from the courts, and yet we have a very color-conscious, right, and a very color-specific system of inequality. It's very hard to solve a color-specific system of injustice, a color-conscious system of injustice with colorblind jurisprudence, as I think I imagine we're beginning to see. Let's talk about that for a second, because it seems there have been a few periods in American law, most of them not particularly well-grounded in history. So Justice Bradley, in those civil rights cases, a very oblivious kind of analysis of what the United States had been up to that point. The Plessy Court, right, when they said, what did they say? They said, well, this separate but equal thing, we don't mean any offense by it, and if there's any offense by it, it's just the offense that you take. We're not implying that black folks are inferior. This is not a badge of slavery. It's not a badge of inferiority unless you take it that way. And if you take it that way, that's on you. It's sort of like the Supreme Court said, I'm sorry if you were offended, right? That's like the modern version of that. Not I'm apologizing for offending you, but I'm apologizing if you're offended by my assumption that separate and unequal is legitimate. So that was also a very ahistoric kind of perspective. Then we had a shift in the mid-20th century. So roughly from the period of Brown v. Board, maybe through the Griggs decision in 1971, you have a period where the court, when it comes to addressing racial issues, begins to look at social science and take social science quite seriously, as it did in the Brown case, to explain why separate but unequal needed to be struck down, all the way through Griggs, where the court says what? They say, look, just because the Duke Power Company didn't necessarily deliberately intend to discriminate against certain persons, they had policies and they had practices and they had procedures in place which created built-in headwinds for some, right, and tailwinds for others, and they believed and created the disparate impact standard at that time to say that too is actionable, that too is illegal, that too is in violation of both our principles and our law. So we had a period there, about 17 years, maybe we could stretch it out to 20, where the courts began to look at social truth, began to look at issues of power, began to broaden their understanding of how discrimination operates and what its impact is. And almost as soon as that's happened, there's a retrenchment. So by 74, the court is ruling in Milliken that there's really not a lot that you can do to desegregate schools. You certainly can't have cross-district busing. A few years later in Bakke, they're reinvigorating the white victim narrative. Here's a guy denied admission to UC Davis Medical School. He was clearly more qualified. The program at UC Davis was discriminatory. White folks, the new victims. And so you begin to see in the 70s and certainly increasing in the 80s and really up until the present, this slow drip and sometimes a very steady roar of retrenchment when it comes to understanding the way that institutional bias operates. The problem with this increasingly colorblind and history-averse, acontextual understanding of America when it comes to race is that it leaves in place those inequalities that cannot be clearly traced to deliberate and vicious racist intent in almost all cases, right? And so think about the case of Alan Bakke. It's a very interesting thing to look at reverse discrimination and white victimhood claims against the actual evidence and ask ourselves, what does it mean that the evidence doesn't actually comport with the decision, right? Because if you look at the case of Alan Bakke, it's a very interesting case to examine for what it says about how quick we are to believe that white people are victims and ignore the institutional and structural inequalities that actually victimize people of color every day. So when Alan Bakke applied to the UC Davis Medical School and was rejected, he decided the reason he had been rejected, and this is what he claimed in court, was that UC Davis had a program that set aside 16 slots in the first-year med school class for underrepresented students, which I believe at that time was specifically for African-American students, 16 slots out of a class of 100, okay? And he said that was discriminatory, and that was the reason that he didn't get in. Now, what's interesting about this is that Alan Bakke was also rejected. He wasn't just rejected at that school. He was rejected at 10 others, right? One of which didn't have any minority set-aside program, 3 more of which had less than 5% applicants of color. So apparently there were a lot of other schools that also, for whatever reason, didn't think Alan Bakke was qualified. One of the possible reasons was he was 37 years old when he applied. Now, it's not nice and it's not legal and it's not fair to discriminate on the basis of age either, but he didn't bring an age claim, interestingly. He wanted to bring a race claim. Now, you can imagine a medical school possibly thinking, I'm not saying it's fair, possibly thinking, well, you know, you're 37 years old and you're just starting med school. By the time you get done with your rotations and you get done with all that stuff and you know, it's going to be an 8-year process. You're not going to be able to pay us back and make alumni contributions till you're like in your mid-40s. So you can imagine a school might decide, again, it's not right, but they might decide that they'd rather take the gamble on the 25-year-old or the 24-year-old or the 23-year-old than the 37-year-old. But it was more advantageous to push this angle of reverse discrimination, even though Alan Bakke didn't have a lot of evidence to suggest that that were true. There were, interestingly, that year, 84 white people who were admitted. He was not one of them. 36 of those 84 white folks had lower test scores than Bakke and had worse grades than Bakke in undergrad, but they got in ahead of him, and he didn't have a problem with that. In other words, there's 36 less qualified white people, right, if we assume grades and test scores are the key to being qualified, 36 less qualified white folks who bumped him. He's angry about the 12 people of color, right? Several of whom had higher scores and grades than he did. It's not like they all had lower grades and scores. So he's angry about a handful of black and brown folk bumping him, not angry about the much larger number of white folks who were bumping him. So was he really the victim of white reverse discrimination or white victimhood? Well, not if we look at the actual evidence. The same is true if you look at some of the other cases that have been examined where we end up looking only at what is right in front of us, not at the larger structures, right? So you look at Jennifer Gratz and her claim against the University of Michigan several years ago, the one that the court ultimately did uphold. When she applied to the University of Michigan and she was rejected, very interesting, Jennifer Gratz's first reaction to this was, I knew I'd been the victim of reverse discrimination. I knew I'd been the victim of injustice because I knew black people who had gotten in even though they had lower scores in grades than me. And I'm incensed. And I've been planning on going to Michigan since I was like 5. She really said this, right? Like she was just going to be a Wolverine. Like that was it. She was set. By first grade, she was like, I know where I'm going. I'm going to Michigan, which that says a lot about entitlement too, doesn't it? Like this idea that you're 5 years old. Like how many black and brown 5-year-olds you think are like, they got their whole college life planned out. They know where they're going. Well, she was just so clear because her dad had gone there or whatever, or her mom had gone there. That says a lot about entitlement. But anyway, so she applies. She doesn't get in. She's convinced it's reverse discrimination. She files a suit. She ends up winning. By the time the case reaches the court, the policy she was upset about had been eliminated. University of Michigan had a policy. They didn't have it anymore, but they had it at the time she applied that had a point system for admission. It's a 150-point scale. And you got points for different things. You got 85 points, up to 85 points for your grades. You got up to 12 points for your SAT score in high school. You got 20 points if you had special athletic talent. There's a whole bunch of stuff. And then there were, the problem was there were 20 points for being an underrepresented minority. That's what she was really upset about, right? Was that you got 20 points if you were an underrepresented minority, which meant they're black folks, Latino folk, or indigenous Native North American peoples, right? And so she said, that's unfair. I lost out on those 20 points. Okay, I guess that's true in the narrowest sense of the term. And I think I could probably make an argument for those 20 points, may or may not hold up legally now, given the court's decision that year in '03. But I think I could make a philosophical argument to justify those 20, but it doesn't really matter. I don't have to do that. The only thing that really matters in this conversation is this. When the court decided that that system was illegitimate and that any system like it was illegitimate because it gave obvious points to people of color and amounted to preference and the victimization of white students, what did they ignore? Well, they ignored a couple of very important things. First, they ignored that the University of Michigan also would give you 10 points for being in-state, right? Regardless of your qualifications. They'd give you another 6 points if you were from the Upper Peninsula of the state of Michigan. I don't know if you've ever been there. Trust me when I tell you that the snow is not the only thing white there, right? So when you're giving out 6 points to people from the UP, indirectly, that's a form of white, rural, northern Michigan preference, which, by the way, I don't have a problem with. I think a state institution should try to represent all portions of the state. So that's a legit 6 points, but nobody complained about that. The court didn't have a problem with it, even though it's an indirect racial preference. It might as well be a proxy for whiteness based on who lives there. But that's, of course, not illegal, and Jenny Gratz didn't care. And, of course, she didn't mind the 10 points she was going to get for being in-state, even though there might be someone across the border in Illinois or across the border in Minnesota or across the border in whatever, that actually was more qualified. I don't know. But it didn't matter to her about that. It didn't matter to her that you got 10 points if you went to one of the state's best high schools, right, in terms of graduation rates and college attendance rates, which she just happened to go to, right, because her parents lived in the right zip code. So who are the people that are disproportionately going to get those 10 points? They're going to be affluent. They're disproportionately going to be white, particularly because the state of Michigan at that time and still today had and has the most segregated K-12 school system in the United States. So she was getting points for being an in-state student. She was getting points for going to the right high school, which overwhelmingly were going to benefit white folks and upper middle class white folks at that. You also got 8 points if you took honors and AP classes, right, which she had done. Those classes are 3 times more available in majority white schools than they are in schools that serve mostly students of color. So you add those together, you get 4 points if you have a parent that went to the institution or a relative. She had that as well. You add all of these points together, and yes, there were 20 points that she couldn't get, and there were probably 58 to 70. There were a few others we could go through, but I won't for time's sake. 58 to 70 points that pretty much only she and other people like her could get, that people of color would very rarely get, and apparently the court didn't mind that, and Jenny Gratz didn't mind that, and the Center for Individual Rights that took her case, they didn't mind that. What does that mean? It means that colorblind jurisprudence only looks at what's right in front of us, what's obvious, a program that specifies opportunity on the basis of race, and it ignores the institutionalized structural ways, right? Much more subtle, much more under the radar, but nonetheless real. If you have 58 to 70 points that are almost exclusively going to go to white folks, but we don't call that affirmative action, and we don't call that white racial preference, and we don't call that preferential treatment, and the court says what? Well, We can't handle that. You know what the court's term for that kind of thing is, right? They call it societal discrimination. That's their phrasing. And they say that they can't do anything about societal discrimination, which is what social scientists and activists call institutional racism. They say, no, we can only deal with the obvious and usually with the intentional, right? And so colorblind jurisprudence leaves in place all of these structures, all of these institutional patterns. To be colorblind in our jurisprudence or the way that we approach the law is absurd on its face if you think about it, right? It would be like, for instance, when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in, what was that, 91, I guess, right? So the ADA is passed in 1991. Now imagine if someone were to suggest that enforcement of the Americans with Disabilities Act, that the enforcement of disability rights and disability rights law should be disability blind. I just want you to fathom that for a minute, right? Like if we were to say, yeah, we need to enforce the ADA, and so let's say that you are in a company and you're thinking, I don't know, should we put a ramp there? Shh, a ramp? My God, if you put a ramp there, you're paying attention to disability. You need to be disability blind because a ramp would suggest that you were noticing that they were disabled and then you were thinking about it and you weren't being, no ramp. What's the obvious problem, right? A disability blind ADA, disability blind disability law would mean you could never remedy discrimination on the basis of disability because that's the thing that triggers the mistreatment, right? But we apparently take a different approach when it comes to race. And I know we do that because there's a different standard of scrutiny, I realize, but the question is, why is that? The question is, why do we have these different standards? And I know people would say, well, we have this really pernicious history of racism, so we have to be especially careful. That's actually pulling a punch. We don't have a very specific history of racism. We have a very specific history of white supremacy, right? So if we're being honest, if we use the generic name, then I get strict scrutiny, right? I get it, like, oh, we got to watch out for those University of Michigan 20 points because that could be abused because, you know, we've abused that stuff before. Right, we have, but never against white people. We don't have a history of that. We don't have a history of systemic exclusion and discrimination against the dominant group. So to make that argument as if somehow we're just not real good at this race thing, and so we have to be careful. Yeah, we're not, but we're not good at this race thing in a very specific direction that marginalizes some at the expense of others. And so colorblind jurisprudence really doesn't allow us to get at that. And that's the first problem. The second problem is that it ignores the ways, not just at the point of employment or the point of admission to college, but generally in society, the way that inequality is structured. So when we talk about things like white privilege, or we talk about things like class privilege or gender privilege or any form of institutional privilege, we're not necessarily talking about, we might be, but we're not necessarily talking about specific policies and specific procedures and specific practices. A lot of times it might be the residual effect of past policies and practices and procedures which continue to keep on giving, so to speak, right? And so we know, for instance, the New York Times a couple years ago now, 2 years ago, had a story on the front page, on the front section, that was talking about how people get jobs in the modern era, particularly in the modern economy since the economic meltdown. They found that roughly half of the new jobs are being filled by what? Is it by way of a test? No. Is it by way of the quality of your resume and how much experience you've had? No. It's on the basis of letters of recommendation written by existing employees on behalf of people who want to work for that company. In other words, if you know Jim over in the accounting department, you're set. If you know Mary over in the HR department, you've got a leg up. Half the jobs being filled that way. Now, that is race neutral in theory, right? Old boys networks are not inherently racist, inherently sexist, inherently classist, but in practice, what the study that the New York Times was reporting on found was that overwhelmingly the folks who will be included in those networks will be who? They will be white, they will be male, they will be affluent, they went to the right schools where they made the right connections, right? Which means that you could be a person of color, you could be a woman of any color. You could be a working class white dude, for that matter. And you might be the most qualified person for that job that just opened, but if you don't know the right people that write a letter for you, you are scratched from half the jobs. Your odds of getting hired now just got cut in half, right? And what that means is, even if there wasn't a single overt racist in any boardroom or any HR department or any hiring authority in America, and I'm not saying that that's the case, but even if it were, it wouldn't matter, would it? Because for half of the job openings, they might as well have racist in the boardroom and in the HR room and sexist in the boardroom and in the HR room, because the outcomes are going to be the same. But what does the legal jurisprudence say on that? It says nothing. The court is not empowered to do anything about that systematized networking that is so critical to getting jobs. So that's a structural form of racial inequality, of gender inequality, of class inequality that the law at present does not get at. Just like the law doesn't really allow us to get at alumni preference for colleges or for graduate school, med school, or law school. Those things are just assumed, even though they have a very clear effect in terms of race and in terms of economics. Those things are presumed to be legitimate because they are not directly about affording a racial preference. They do not intentionally create that inequality. Those networks bring about the same result, but our law has not caught up with the way that racism operates in this particular day and age. We're looking at racism in sort of its 1.0 form, right? That's what the courts are doing. They're looking for 1.0 racism. And the reality is society has done a software upgrade and the courts miss that, right? Some folks are still running the old hardware. Don't get me wrong, and the old, they're on the same mainframe, they're running the 1.0. Like the guys coming tonight, that's some 1.0 shit right there. Like they're bringing 1.0, right? But there's been an upgrade, right? Racism can shape shift, it takes on different forms. And the law isn't really, as currently interpreted, allowing us to get at those forms of structural inequality. Same thing is true with schools. Right, so a couple years ago, I was debating the head of the college Republicans at UC Berkeley on television, and he was, making all the sort of standard arguments against any form of affirmative action or policy targeted toward those who've been excluded from opportunity. And he was talking about how unfair it was when he applies to, now here he is, he's going to one of the best schools in the country, right? And keep in mind, California got rid of affirmative action when this kid was in preschool, right? So, but he's still complaining about it, like it even exists in his state. It has not existed since 1996, right? So this cat wasn't even kept out of like first grade by affirmative action, let alone UCLA or wherever it is he really wanted to go, as opposed to Berkeley, which is such a come down apparently. But he's all upset. He's all upset, and he says it's not fair, when we're applying for jobs, we're applying for colleges, and he said something. Is said many, many times, something along the lines of, if I have a friend and if he'd just been black, he would have gotten into blah, 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 right? Here's the problem with that. And let's just think, because a lot of people say that. If I had just been Latino, I would have been set. If I'd just been Native American, I would have had my path smooth and easy, right? Like people say that, like if I had just been black, I would have gotten into Yale. Okay, here's the problem. If you'd have been black, you'd have been black your whole life, not just the day that you applied to Yale, right? Like you wouldn't have been the white person you actually are for 18 years, and then that day, then you're black. And then you get a leg up. Like you'd have been black the whole damn time, so you'd have been twice as likely to have a parent that was unemployed than your actual white self, 3 times as likely to be in a family that was in poverty as opposed to your actual white family. You'd have been in a family that would have had on average 1/20th of the net worth of the white family that you were actually in. You would have gone to a school that had twice as many AP classes, twice as many high qualified experienced teachers, half as many new teachers with only 1 or 2 years of experience. You would have been 1/12th as likely to be in a concentrated poverty school. So by all means, tell me the one again about how life would have been so much easier if you'd been a person of color, right? But the kid meant well, so I was nice to, I was more of a smart ass here than I was with him, because he seemed very sweet and genuine and wrong, but the point is, he's not thinking about that, right? He's thinking about the obvious. He's actually doing what the courts do, right? At least in the modern era, which is he's looking at the obvious policy that is seen as race specific, and he's ignoring all the other, right? Because the reality is, by the time people apply to college, there's been 13 years, K through 12, 13 years of preferential treatment for the dominant group. Now, I'm not saying every member of the dominant group receives that equally. I realize that there are differences in terms of economic status, differences in terms of sex and gender, differences in terms of sexuality, disability, region of the country. I realize that white privilege doesn't play out the same for everyone, right? But in general, there are some commonalities about, just like for black and brown folks, life is not the same for all black and brown folks. But to be black means something in America. To be Latino means something in America. To be Asian American means something. Indigenous means something. To be Arab American right about now certainly means something, right? To be Muslim, wherever you're from, means something. And to be white has to also mean something. You know, in my book, White Like Me, I use the analogy of snowflakes, right? Like, you know, the old saying, every snowflake is different. Now, I don't know how the hell they know that, actually, but that's what I've been told since I was a child. Like, I mean, they could be some that look exactly the same, and I don't guess we'd ever know. But anyway, they say all snowflakes are different, but here's the deal, and all white folks are different too. But the thing about snowflakes is you know a damn snowflake when you see a snowflake. And when you see it, you go, oh, that's a snowflake. And you can figure out pretty much something about its life trajectory. You may not get it exactly right, but you're not going to be far off the mark in a country where whiteness has been created as this construct that has real material, psychological meaning. And so when we talk about things like affirmative action, or we talk about policies targeted to members of groups that have been not only underrepresented, which is a very awful passive term, right, but actually have been marginalized and have been discriminated against and truly victimized by systems of inequality, we have to be willing to look at the evidence beneath the obvious. We have to be willing to look at the systemic, at the structural, and hopefully push our jurisprudence in a direction that allows us to remedy for that. There's another thing we have to do, though, because it isn't just that colorblind jurisprudence misses the subtle institutional stuff. What it also does, it doesn't keep up with what we know from brain science about how racism and discrimination often manifest in the modern era. So here we are at this particular moment, right? We're 50 years past Selma. We just had the commemorative event the other day. The movie is out. If you haven't seen it, you should. It's fabulous. But anyway, so we have this image in our head, again, of 1.0 racism. Real obvious stuff. Right, getting beat on a bridge, nothing subtle about that, nothing 2.0 about that, right? That's very obvious. And that's the kind of racism that was in our face pretty much on a regular basis at that time. Now, it'd be pretty naive, and I know people sometimes will say things like, boy, I sure am glad that police don't beat people in the street anymore, you know? And then you look around and go, oh, wait, okay. Right, so 1.0 still happens, and we know the Justice Department report on Ferguson talks about an entire pattern and practice of abuse, not just things like brutality, but, you know, targeting black communities basically to fund city government, just giving them tickets on some trifling stuff that doesn't mean anything, ignoring white folks doing the same thing, bringing black folks in, fining them, and then fining them again, and basically creating almost like debtor's prison. You know, if you don't pay the fine, now you can actually be arrested for contempt of court and all these things. They were doing this on the backs of black folks. So that's sort of old school stuff. But what's interesting is we know that there's a lot, and theoretically the law can get at that, right? The Justice Department has said this is a problem, and now they're moving to try to remedy that. That's great. We can deal with the 1.0. We don't always do it, but at least theoretically we can. The problem is that what the brain science tells us from the field mostly of social psychology is that a lot of racism in the modern era is operating at the level of the implicit or the subconscious, right? And the law doesn't help us get at that. What do I mean? Well, you've probably heard of some of the tests for implicit or subconscious unconscious bias, the implicit association test at Harvard, for instance, which has been run hundreds of thousands of times, enough to have statistical validity at a very high level. And what has it found? It finds that the vast majority of folks have internalized anti-black biases, they've internalized anti-Latino biases, they've internalized sexist biases against women. Interestingly, the studies have found that even the target group internalizes biases against itself. Almost half of African Americans have internalized anti-black bias at the subconscious level, which can operate in all kinds of ways in terms of how folks view themselves, how they operate in the world, how they interact with others, right? And so this is a problem that we can now see and we can study it, but the law doesn't know what to do with this. There was a study a few years back where they took white folks who were not at all overtly racist. They were all appropriately liberal for what that's worth, and it's worth nothing, trust me, right? You took these nice white liberal people, they gave them a test to test for overt racism. They all passed with flying colors, felt very good about themselves, you know. And then they hooked them up to brain scan imaging machines. And they put them in front of computer terminals and started flashing images on the screen very, very quickly, right? 85 milliseconds, I believe, was what it was. Not fast enough for the conscious mind to even know what it saw, but fast enough for the subconscious mind to register the image that it sees, just like those subliminal messages they used to stick in movies back in the 50s, from what I understand. They used to put in early 60s. You go to the movie theater and you'd be sitting there watching the movie, and then they put in like on just one frame or two frames, it'd say popcorn, right? And then all of a sudden you'd be like, damn, I think I need to get some popcorn. You didn't even want any popcorn. Now you're all like, everybody's getting up, going to the concession stand to get popcorn, right? Because that's how subliminal advertising worked. And so the same thing was happening with this test. They were essentially flashing these images really, really quick. You wouldn't know consciously what you'd seen, but subconsciously you would. And remember, these were all, liberal, not overtly racist people. They were showing really innocuous symbols for most of the test, blade of grass, bunny rabbit, a beach ball, nothing, would really get a whole lot of brain activity going. Then they flash the image of a black male face for 85 milliseconds. And that part of the brain that lit up was the part that controls executive function, which means that that's the part that's trying to respond rationally to fear and anxiety, is what the hypothesis of the researchers were saying, that that part of your brain acts up when you're trying to control an emotional response, when you're trying to control a fear or anxiety-based response. That's sort of the way that your brain tries to check that. So the good news is they didn't just freak out, right, and run from the room not knowing why they had done it, because it was subliminal anyway. But when that part of the brain gets activated, and only for that picture, that's a way of telling you that these nice white liberal people were trying to shut down a fear response or an anxiety response, right? Why would they be needing to do that, these nice white liberal people? Why would they be having a fear and anxiety response at the image of a black male face? Do they think this dude's going to come off the screen and choke them? Well, apparently. Right? Apparently there's been some conditioning, and as soon as that face was gone, that reaction went away, and it was the only image that provoked that reaction. Does that mean that those are bad people? No. Does that mean that they're overtly racist people? No. But does that mean that in given situations, it might be possible to trigger some type of stereotype at the subconscious level, which, because it's subconscious, they don't know they're acting on it. Right? They could be sitting in an interview room interviewing somebody for a job, right? Or they could be a teacher in front of the classroom, and you could be interacting with the students, asking questions, students answering questions. And if those subtle, implicit, subconscious biases exist, and you don't know they're there because they're subconscious, that's the point, then how you respond to that student when they might get the answer wrong. We've all had that experience. We raise our hand and we don't get it right. Well, is that going to trigger a stereotype in the mind of the educator about the person if that person is from a stigmatized group? See, if I do it, it's not going to have that effect, right? If I get the answer wrong, nobody is going to have a subtle, subconscious, or conscious bias that says, ugh, white men, clearly, right? Why'd we let them in here? That's not the reaction. That's why you can be president of the United States and mispronounce every fifth word out of your mouth as long as you're white. And you can get away with that. And folks will make jokes about it. No, it's just, he's from Texas. You got to understand, right? But if this president, the one who's the president now, had done that, right? Hell, they gave him a lot of problems just for, pronouncing Pakistan correctly, right? Like, how dare he say Pakistan? What is he? Is he some overeducated, knows how to pronounce stuff, foreign brown guy, right? You can't even speak correctly when you're black and not catch hell. Right? But if he were going around making up words, which the last one did, right, it would have triggered stereotypes. Maybe not at the conscious level, but at the subconscious level. That's what the research is telling us happens. It happens in interviews, it happens in classrooms, it happens with interactions between law enforcement and folks on the street. See, a lot of that stuff that happens between cops and communities is not based on overt bias on the part of police. I'm not saying there isn't some of that going on. You can see that. You know that that's happening. But there's also that subtle bias that gets triggered in an instant, right? And particularly when it comes to law enforcement, where they have to make these snap decisions, if that subconscious bias is in their head, there's a very good possibility that they may act on that. Not because they're Klansmen, not because they're overtly hateful people, but because they have been conditioned by the same stuff we've all been conditioned by. See, advertising works, right? That's why folks spend billions of dollars to sell you stuff. It's not just that they got money to blow, right? They want to have advertisements because they know that if you see enough ads, you'll buy their stuff. And if you don't believe me, ask yourself how the Taco Bell Crunch Wrap became a thing. Because nobody wanted that. Nobody was lobbying for that. None of y'all were writing letters to Taco Bell saying, you know what we need at 6 o'clock in the damn morning? We need a taco wrapped up in a burrito with some breakfast food in it. That's what we need. Nobody was asking for that, but now y'all have bought it, see? Because they start running the commercials, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, I didn't know I needed a Crunch Wrap, but I apparently really need the Crunch Wrap. Advertising works. And if they can make you buy that, or they can make you switch tennis shoe brands or smartphone brands or toothpaste and toilet paper based on seeing the ads, the research says 12 ads is all it takes. 12 ads is all it takes to exponentially increase the likelihood that you'll purchase a particular consumer product once you've seen it 12 times. If you can make somebody switch toilet paper after 12 ads, don't tell me that you can't convince people of racial stereotypes because they've seen that ad more than 12 times, right? We've seen those ads all of our lives: racial stereotypes, gender stereotypes, class stereotypes, religious stereotypes, disability-based stereotypes. So the point is, we have all of this evidence, really incontrovertible, that racism and discrimination is happening because of subtle biases, but what does the law do about that? The law says virtually nothing about that. There are individual courts in this country that have taken it upon themselves to interject a little consciousness into this process, to challenge implicit racial bias, sometimes with jury instructions. There are some judges who have done this, particularly in juvenile court sessions, where they will talk to juries about, and they'll talk, and not just juvenile court, but criminal court generally in a couple of states. Washington State, I believe, does it in a few places, where they'll tell juries, that there's a lot of research that says sometimes when faced with someone who's a defendant who is from a racial minority group or underrepresented, whatever term they might use, there's a tendency to sometimes bring stereotypes into the analysis. Just make sure you're not doing that kind of thing. Basically, just putting them on notice to be careful, right, about the possibility based on what the social science research says. But very few courts do that. And the law certainly has not caught up with that concept. So what we've got is civil rights law responding to old school 1.0 forms of discrimination. And we have 2.0 forms. And we have a court that is increasingly hostile to anything that attempts to remedy even the 1.0.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you're doing great from wherever you watch me from. I'm your host and presenter, Agent Stories. Let's talk about this. Now, Tim Wise begins his critique by outlining how white privilege functions as an invisible system of unearned advantages conferred upon white individuals, often without the consciousness of acknowledgement. Remember, in his view, many white Americans are afflicted with what he calls historical amnesia, a willful forgetting of the institutional advantages their ancestors received through slavery, segregation, land theft, and economic exclusion of non-white people. This erasure makes it easy to dismiss black pain as victim mentality instead of seeing it as a residual effect of centuries of racial injustice. I would like to point this out. In as much as it might seem that black people are doing wrong things in the society, people are calling black neighborhoods or ghetto life and all those stuff, did you really take your time to think about it in this way? That we are having all those type of problem because it is a white person that inflicted it on the black people. And all these are traumatic experiences that are recurring. And so it is safe to say that it is not the likeness of black people to do what they're doing. But again, I understand as a black people, we also need to take accountability, right? And one of the accountable things that we need to do as black people is to educate the people that are behind us, the young ones, our young brothers and sisters. If you have kids, please teach them about this history, because it's really, really important for us to come and have a discussion in regards to this. I'm also going to be talking about deflection and the victimhood narrative, and I think I've always tried to address this. Tim Wise also argues that when white individuals accuse black people of playing the victim, they are engaging in deflection, an emotional and rhetorical strategy used to avoid uncomfortable truths. Rather than acknowledging how systemic racism continues to shape outcomes in housing, healthcare, policing, education, and unemployment, they shift the focus to individual responsibility. Dr. Tim Wise contends that these shifts absolves white people from the duty of self-reflection and systemic change. Also, another things that we can draw from Wise is that he talks about Wise draws on a psychology to explain this behavior. For many white Americans, accepting the reality of racial privilege challenges the core of their identity and their belief in a meritocratic society. To admit that their social status may be built on a stolen labor, denied opportunity, or racial exclusion means confronting moral complicity. To avoid that discomfort, racial exclusion means confronting moral complicity. Again, to avoid that discomfort, they cling to narrative that blame black people for their conditions, portraying them as whiners or dependents rather than as survivors of a structurally violent system. Talking about legal doctrines as tools of racial hierarchy. Remember, Dr. Tim Wise also points to how American legal doctrines were historically constructed to protect white advantage. From the Dred Scott v. Sanford decision to redlining laws and the war on drugs, the legal system was often used to criminalize or control black life. The legacy of these doctrines still persists. Thus, when white people call on the law as neutral arbiter, they ignore how laws were used to legitimize racial oppression. Wise asserts that any real conversation about race must be taken into account the role of legal structures in sustaining inequality. I'm also going to be talking about false equivalency and the erasure of structural violence. Accusing black people of victimhood often rests on the false equivalence, suggesting that everyone in America faces hardship, and thus race is not a central factor. Wise break this down by showing how race is a structural multiplier that intensifies hardship. A poor white person and a poor black person do not face the same risks from police, landlords, employers, or courts. To ignore that is to flatten the complexity of American inequality. Talking about the weaponization of colorblindness, when you get to here, there is a lecture, special lecture that Dr. Tim Wise also talks about colorblindness in its own as a topic. Dr. Tim Wise critiques the ideology of colorblindness, which is often weaponized by white conservatives and liberals alike. They claim that I don't see race allows individuals to avoid responsibility while still benefiting from racial disparities. Dr. Tim Wise says that this ideology is not just naive, it is dangerous. By refusing to see race, societies refuse to see racism. When black people raise concerns about injustice, colorblind ideologies dismisses them as divisive or hypersensitive, again, reinforcing the playing the victim trope. Talking about the moral inversion of racial disclosure, there is a moral inversion at play when white Americans position themselves as the real victims of racial disclosure. Wise discusses how some white people feel oppressed by diversity policies or affirmative action, framing efforts towards equity as discrimination against them. The inversion undermines real attempts to address historical wrongs and positions justice as an attack on white people. Thus, this derails productive dialogue. Also, another important thing that I also think that Dr. Tim Wise also talks about is that Wise highlights how conservative media, for example, Fox News, talk radio, certain social media influencers, fuel the narrative that of black victimhood as manipulation. These outlets amplify stories of black entitlement, quote unquote, or race hustling, quote unquote, while ignoring or downplaying institutional racism. This constant repetition conditions large segments of white population to view any racial complaint as exaggerated or fraudulent, contributing to a climate of racial denialism. Why owning up is hard but necessary, and I think this is what most of white folks need to do. Dr. Tim Wise emphasizes that true reconciliation begins with acknowledgement. White people must confront the truth of racial injustice, not only in the past, but in the present. This involves discomfort, vulnerability, and willingness to give up unearned advantages. Accusing black people of victimhood is easier than doing that work, but it leads to social decay rather than renewal. And so it's important. We own up, people own up, right? And it is time for people to reclaim the truth. Tim Wise work argues America to move beyond shallow accusation that black people are playing the victim. Instead, it calls for an honest reckoning with history, a dismantling of the systemic roots of white privilege, and a collective commitment to racial equity. Until white people stop using denial as a shield the nation cannot heal. So, what some see as victimhood is, in fact, a testimony, witnessing centuries of oppression with the hope that the truth will lead to justice. And I think these are the most important discussions or conversations that we need to have, especially watching all these things, crazy things that are happening in the United States. And again, I'll say thanks to Dr. Tim Wise for always coming up and talking about this. This is just an example of a white person using their privilege to tell the truth, to say the truth about all these issues, about all these factors that are going on. So honestly, I really want to know what you think about this. I really want to know what you have to say about this. Because at the end of the day, these are the discussions that we need to have. But until then, I'm hoping to see you in my next video. It is just a plea. If you're watching me for the first time again, I'm asking you to please subscribe to my channel, join my membership, and really get to what I can offer you. But until then, let me see you in my next video. Peace, love, and harmony. Salute.